Welcome everyone. The presentation will begin in just a moment. This session will be recorded and will last 60 minutes, about 45 minutes of presentation, followed by time for questions and answers. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentation and turn off your cameras. If you have a question or comment, please enter it into the chat during the presentation, and it will be addressed during the question and answer period. You may also ask questions with video during the question and answer portion. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 1 week after this live event. My name is Dr. Catherine Showalter, and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. TESOL International Association's Speech, Pronunciation, and Listening Intersection is pleased to present this webinar titled Re-Conceptualizing the Materials of English Language Development, the Materials English Language Development Teachers Use to Design Listening Experiences for University-Bound Multilingual Scholars. Our speaker today is Dr. Jennifer LaCroix, a pedagogy-focused applied linguist. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar, and now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. LaCroix.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome. As Kate mentioned, my name is Jennifer LaCroix. I have been affiliated with TESOL International now for many, many years. I am always thrilled with the content that the SPLIS intersection is providing us as TESOL practitioners or administrators or researchers. So I just want to offer my special thank you and my gratitude to SPLIS and to Kate for organizing this event and for welcoming me. Thank you. I will be going through slides today, but I encourage you to use the chat box. I would like to know if you have any questions along the way, feel free to ask. I will pause occasionally and look at the chat box. So please consider this an interactive webinar. The material I'm presenting today is part of my dissertation research that I did at Boston University over the span of several years. And what I would like to share with you is the overarching findings of my case study. So when I talk about reconceptualizing the materials English language development teachers use, what I'm providing is a space for us to reconsider and reflect on practices. There are things that we are doing very well that I will share with you that I have observed teachers, experienced teachers to do, in particular with the idea of listening as a skill that needs further development for almost all of us, both monolingual and monolingual multilingual speakers and language users. But I also want to think about this space in terms of scholars who are already preparing for university or who are already in university. So I'm thinking of this space as how we're preparing university-bound multilingual scholars. And by multilingual, I mean, I was investigating a space where there are students from many countries around the world who spoke multiple languages. So I want to start just by asking the bigger question, which is, who are you? So just one moment. Having a tech problem here, Kate.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, sorry about that. So who are you? If you could give me some information about whether or not you're a student or a practitioner working with younger learners, or you're a practitioner working with older learners, or if you're a program director, administrator. Great. Okay, wonderful. So welcome, Jennifer. I'm seeing an instructor from the University of Oregon teaching speaking and listening to university students. Perfect. Welcome. Anyone else willing to share a little bit about who you are in the chat box? Hi, Owen, an instructional specialist. Great, at a community college. Great, welcome Owen and Jennifer. Hi, Renee. Oh, interesting. Okay, a new project for ESL for musicians. Okay, interested in teaching, okay, students who are going into music. Great. Hi, Egla, welcome, an instructor from Northeastern University, working with international students, teaching listening and speaking. Thank you, Egla, welcome. Hi, Anna, teaching college-bound students at the University of Baltimore. Great, welcome. Okay, so it's helpful for me to have a sense now of how to frame this. It seems like we're all more or less on the same page in terms of this idea that we have these the older student, and by older, if they're university, there's tensions, right, around whether or not there's this sensitive period. This affects a lot of people's perspectives on pronunciation, but what I'm very interested in is how we conceptualize listening. And many of us might think of listening as something that we do in the form of a test, or we might think of it as something that we do in the form of teaching conversation skills. Sorry, Kate. Can you hear me? I'm having another tech problem with the advancement.
Might need to, I don't know if maybe stopping it and then trying again might work.
Oh, I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, it's being really
just a little bit slow.
My apologies. It's being very
no worries.
Sorry about that. So what I want you to think about is, are we focused on creating spaces that build conversation in our classes? Are we mostly concerned, as Kate was telling me at the beginning of our chat today, is that it's often hard to get people who specialize in listening to do a webinar, that there are very few people doing listening and most people seem interested in speaking. I think I can say as a researcher that I see this reflected in what we're doing in the field. So I invite you today to reconceptualize the materials we're using and to reconsider the value of listening. Listening is a very complex term. It's difficult to define. So I'll give you a bit of background to help contextualize the study. I'll provide a descriptive framework to help you understand how I'm considering listening and what I call a listening experience. And then at the very end, I'll ask more questions in terms of what we might do in terms of reconsidering the materials we use. So the takeaway today is that I hope you leave thinking about your listening practice a little bit differently and reconsidering how you might interact with your students in terms of the framing of what we call listening. So a bit of background, this study, as I said, was case study research. This took place in an academically oriented university-based intensive English program in the United States. I will refer to it as USEP thereafter. Participants in my study were very experienced instructors. They had been teaching at minimum for 10 years in the field. All of them held at least a master's in TESOL or applied linguistics. They had all been assigned to teach a listening and speaking class for a semester, and 7 of them participated in semi-structured interviews, from which I selected 2 to observe more closely. So the methodology I used was qualitative case study, and I had so much data I didn't even know what to do with. Originally, I thought about pulling some of my findings through the frameworks that other researchers in listening have established. And the reason for that is because listening is really hard to pin down. One of the challenges I had as a researcher was, how could I determine in my observations when listening was happening? What does listening pedagogy really look like, right? Is it when students are interacting with each other in the classroom? Is it general classroom rhetoric? Is it you're listening to me right now as I'm talking and giving you this webinar? You know, what is it exactly? And what do we determine is the listening part of our speaking and listening class. Doesn't have to be audio from a textbook. Does it have to be a textbook that someone in your department said you have to use? Can it be something from the internet? Is it a TED Talk? Is it a podcast? I mean, what are we defining here as listening? So this case study really kind of focused me to look at listening in terms of how this particular setting was conceptualizing of it. So I looked first at the listening levels. So in a listening and speaking class, this USEP program was using the European Common Framework. So on a scale of 2 being on the lower side, that would be the equivalent of an A2, all the way up to level 8, which would be the level B2 plus or C1 in the Common European Framework. And I'm not going to go through all of these little details, and I realize this is a very text-heavy slide, which I apologize for, but I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of at least how the teachers in this particular program where I was observing were conceptualizing of listening in terms of what the students needed to be able to do at the end. So these are considered the student learning outcomes. And we start at level 2 here because this is a university program, so most students are already testing at A2 or higher. In fact, the 2 classes I ended up observing were the level 8 and level 7 classes, which is where most students are mostly saturated, meaning most of them are more advanced listeners. And so they're on the cusp of full acceptance and full matriculation, either into an undergraduate or graduate program, but maybe they're missing that qualifying score for TOEFL or IELTS, or something is still preventing them, and they're needing some additional supports. So what supports are they being offered in this program? The takeaway here is that I want to make a distinction between what's expected at the higher level and what's expected at the lower level of a listener. So we can see the audio, at least in terms of length, if we're thinking of just audio, as something we can use from a textbook or a video, needs to be about 12 to 15 minutes in length, according to this program, from the most advanced student, and as minimum or as little as 2 minutes for a lower level listener. So as I collected data and looked at what these experienced teachers were doing in this very advanced program, very well respected, they had a lot of great practices. So some of the most observed, most saturated practices that I saw might be something that resonates with you. For example, right before they used the listening portion of their class, if they were using a textbook, which they often were, they would pre-teach the vocabulary from the textbook. Probably all of you who are instructors might be able to identify with this idea of using a textbook where the textbook authors have selected maybe 12 to 15 lexical or phrasal items that they want the learner to engage with and to think about before they encounter the listening. So maybe this is in the form of matching, maybe this is a form of here's the word and here's a definition. There are multiple ways that we probably go about teaching vocabulary. And I certainly support that this idea of pre-teaching vocabulary and activating background knowledge, which is more what I call a top-down skill to borrow from the cognitive world, is very important. Teachers also were observed to do a lot of activation of background knowledge via pair and small group work in terms of here are 3 or 4 questions. I want you to lead a discussion or hold a discussion with your classmates before I press play. So teachers would circulate, or if I was observing them on Zoom, they would put the students into breakout rooms, have them focus on the discussion questions for 2 or 3 minutes, and then come back before they did the audio. So these are the most saturated practices I've observed teachers to use that all relate to activating background knowledge and more top-down skills. I also noticed that teachers tend to favor textbook audio. They use a little bit of TED Talks, and they love student oral presentations. this makes sense. It's certainly easier to measure output in the forms of an oral presentation than it is to get inside someone's head and wondering just how much are they listening. The way that we tend to find out how much learners are listening and how much they're understanding from their listening is in the form of assessment. This is this old, what I call an old tension that's been in the field for many years now, probably several decades, that many of the listening scholars have written about, is this tension between product, that end result in the form of, say, a listening assessment, and process. How do we go about teaching the process of how to engage? But again, as I was trying to observe the listening part of class with these experienced instructors, I also was pushed myself to reconceptualize what exactly I was considering as listening. So I want you to consider for a moment, please, or just think about, what are your steps in planning for the listening part of your class? If you feel comfortable unmuting yourselves or would like to share, this is an opportunity to do a share out. If you feel comfortable writing something in the chat box, I encourage you to write something in the chat box. Or if you're feeling shy, that's also okay. It can be a think about that maybe we can revisit. But I'm curious, this is a pause for me. What are your steps in planning for the listening part of your class? Okay, Owen, go ahead. I see your hand. Thank you. Go ahead. Hi.
Yeah, one thing I like to do is have one of my students be the one to introduce the text and be the expert on the listening text, whether it's a podcast that they've found, and then have them create questions for their classmates. So I think sometimes with the textbooks, you can have the student facilitate that in the textbook, but if you have students going out and finding audio content that they're passionate about, that they're the expert in, that they know more about than I do, and they're guiding their classmates through, that changes the power relationships a lot, and it also brings in content that at least one student is really excited about listening to and sharing.
Thanks, Owen. You're so brave, and I appreciate that comment. It's funny because I was telling Kate at the beginning of this webinar, as we were making small talk while you're in the waiting room, that I went to my first in-person presentation for the first time in 2 years on Tuesday night, and it was Diane Larson Freeman. And she spoke at Boston University, which is what I'm a graduate of and where I've taught also for many years. And she was talking about her complex dynamic systems theory. And that was one of her takeaways, is to empower the students to create more autonomy. And there is no perfect way to teach. There is no perfect way to teach listening. But thinking about what the students want, and I like what you're saying, having them bring things in or empowering them is what I heard you say, having them introduce a text or have them bring in the things they're interested in, I think is a wonderful best practice that we can certainly build upon. Other ideas from anyone in the audience or anyone else feeling brave enough to take themselves off mute? You can raise your hand virtually. Okay, thank you, Owen. Maybe we'll come back later. Oh, and thank you. I see a few comments in the chat box. So hello to Joe Siegel. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming. I know it's really late in Sweden. But he's saying to identify the target text, pick sub-skills, something top-down, gist related on the first listening, something bottom-up, parsing practice on the second. And thanks, Joe. I might ask you to say more about that towards the end if you feel comfortable. And Jennifer Rice, to everyone, I think about bottom-up and top-down listening skills and use those to guide students for success in the unit project. So thank you for sharing them. Those are all very good practices to consider. So the big question then is, why do I feel, based on this research that I conducted, that we need to redesign our teaching materials, especially around listening for? What I observed is a lot of before listening practice pre-teaching vocabulary, facilitating the pre-listening discussions, clarifying directions. Clarifying directions was the #1 practice, the most saturated practice, which doesn't come as a surprise. This is also the work of Suzanne Graham and her colleagues when they conducted studies in the UK of how French teachers are teaching French as a foreign language. They also found in observational studies, that's where students or teachers spend most of their time, or English language development or French development teachers. So that makes sense. I didn't see anything going on during, and I'll talk about what I mean by during in just a moment here. And then I saw a lot of after listening practices. Maybe it was a turn and talk. What did you understand? Play it again, play it a second time, check, look at the transcript, fill out some multiple choice questions. Did you get it? Great, turn it in. So I'm asking us to maybe reconsider moving away from this process product orientation that we've been using in the field for the past 10+ years, and to consider a new descriptive framework, which I call a listening experience. So a listening experience is something that I would suggest a practitioner might want to take more seriously when considering the listening part of the listening and speaking class, if we're using that dichotomy. And I would like the term to be something where English language development teachers are considering more the complexity involved with listening. We've heard about top down, we've heard about bottom up, but it's also very messy. Listening is very complex, but complex doesn't have to mean chaotic. There can be a systematic approach. The thing is, we have to think about what are our systems, and can we move beyond the pre-teaching of vocabulary and the pre-listening discussion questions, which are great practices, wonderful, but completely oversaturated. What moves can we make to do something, especially during that crucial during? And by the during, I think of when the students are getting stuck and they're not understanding, what do we do to unpack that for them? So 2 important characteristics of what I call how we design for a listening experience include adaptation and directionality. So in adaptation, teachers are drawing on a range of adapted versus unadapted audio or video materials in their teaching. Adapted would be something that's already been selected for a textbook that considers that English language learners or scholars are still developing, and so speed is something that's taken into consideration. I think of adapted materials as being very scripted, and for me, a little more phony and not as authentic as unadapted materials. So unadapted materials for this study, I conceptualized as any audio material that hasn't been changed from its original format for a particular learner. So someone who's still in the process of learning English specifically, these materials don't take that into consideration. It could be a TED Talk. It could be something that mimics more natural, fluid, face-to-face comprehension, or face-to-face dialogue, or face-to-face communication, or Zoom. So directionality of listening, I considered 3 forms: unidirectional, bidirectional, and multidirectional. So what I mean by directionality is this refers to the flow of communication. As humans, we engage in different kinds of listening activities in daily life all the time. I usually listen to music when I'm at home. I'm a huge music enthusiast. In the car, I listen to music. Sometimes I listen to the radio. If it's news, sometimes I listen to an audiobook. But I'm also listening to my colleagues at work. I'm listening to my students. I'm having conversations. Maybe I'm part of a panel discussion for TESOL and I'm one of 4 or 5 speakers and I'm listening to everyone. Or as a student, maybe I'm participating in a critical discussion. And most times, if we're in the context of the critical discussion in a classroom, we're allowed to go off topic. So it can be very easy to say, let's stick to the reading and only talk about what's been read during those discussions. But let's face it, learners don't like to just stick to the script. They don't want to just talk about what they read. They want to apply their top-down knowledge. They want to apply things from the real world. And so this can be hard to track if we're not teaching students how to track when people go off topic and we're not preparing for multi-directionality, this can be challenging. So within these activities, 3 directionalities of unidirectional listening, bi-directional, and multi-directional are things that we need to consider. So for example, the mock lecture. We all know this from our audio textbooks. If we've used something from Listening and Note-Taking Skills by Patricia Dunkel, for example, we know that there's a whole section on, say, like a Chinese emperor or pyramids or jobs today or an interview with Andrew McCarthy, right? So these often are more unidirectional, unless with the exception of the interview piece with Andrew McCarthy. These are things where it's one speaker is kind of mimicking the professor giving the lecture, and students are listening, maybe they're taking notes, and then maybe they're filling out some sort of assessment after. This would be what we usually hear on a TOEFL or an IELTS examination or TOEIC. So I refer to the term unidirectional, refer to one speaker. So in this, it's usually scripted, it takes the form of a lecture or a talk, where the listener is typically positioned as receptive. Then we have the conversation, bi-directional. I think of this as more communicative listening, having the conversation with your student, having the conversation with a colleague. In an academic setting, this might be two people in a chemistry class, working in a laboratory and talking about an experiment. It could be a student having a conversation with an advisor or professor. We know these from our TOEFL listening. If you're taught TOEFL before, here, listen to the following. It's a conversation between a student and the advisor. What does the advisor mean when the advisor says this? And you hear it repeated a second time. And then the students are, answering the questions of these multiple choice questions and hopefully getting them right. But what we don't really seem to really think about from what I have observed is that we're not really looking at the multi-directional panel discussion or how to track multiple interlocutors. So what I mean by multi-directional listening is I'm describing more of the fluid, raw, unplanned, novel discourse of multi-party conversation involving 3 or more speakers, right? 3 or more people who are engaged in a setting with different participants, and anyone can take a turn at any time, right? So multiple utterances are occurring. So this could be listeners are learning to listen to a panel discussion. This could be something from an online course and you're using it in your class or a workplace meeting. So the next piece beyond directionality is choosing sources for a listening experience. So as we think about the sources, you've already heard me talk a lot about textbook audio or live classroom discourse or rhetoric. So the listening source, this is something that the instructor is thinking about ahead of time and considering how will this aid listening instruction and or listening practice for the L2 listener. And this is from Lynch 2012. So examples for English language development, there are web-based listening libraries, portable electronic devices. Some of these then might have visual options. We can use closed captions to help increase comprehension. We can use transcripts. We can use Google Translate, right? So I ask you now, I'm going to pause again and ask you, what adapted and unadapted sources do you use when you're planning for your listening speaking class or the listening portion of your instruction? You can raise your hand virtually, take yourself off mute, write something in the chat. I'll take a glass or a sip of water here because I get thirsty when I'm talking. I already had to teach this morning, so my voice, I can tell, is getting dry. So considerations, what adapted or unadapted sources are you using? Okay, great. Looks like. So Owen, just to go back to your point, I don't explicitly teach students strategy terms like top down, bottom up. I don't think they need to know that. If my students are teachers, then yes, but not directly students. Yeah, Joe Siegel also avoids teaching the terms. Instead, the practical applications. I agree with Joe on this. Hi, Nina, welcome. Okay, so Anna says she uses StoryCorps, or Anna uses StoryCorps, great. StoryCorps, Egla, great. NPR's Out of the Blocks, really good. Thank you, Owen. We Speak NYC, thank you. YouTube video interviews, thanks, Renee. Authentic Materials, thank you. NPR, that's a popular one. TED Talks, student discussions, BBC News, random YouTube clips. TED Talks live speakers, thank you, Joy. Thank you, Jennifer. VOC screen app. So I can see there are a lot of great ideas here. So you're already thinking about the adaptability. Hopefully now you're also considering the directionality. So I want to revisit the listening levels. So again, when I started this webinar, I mentioned I had conducted a study at a university-based intensive English program where they really were looking at things on the European framework, but scaling things from a level of 2 to 8. Lower listening levels at USEP really meant listening to something for roughly 2 to 5 minutes at most, using adapted materials. And as things got into the higher level, which is the classes I observed, meaning they were a level 7 or an 8, in the higher listening levels, the more advanced listener, could track and extract information from linguistically unadapted college level audio materials on an unfamiliar topic for roughly 12 to 15 minutes in length. So I can already see where all of the materials that you're mentioning, those that are especially unadapted, would fit in very well with what we do for these upper level listeners. So far right now, what I want you to think about is this idea of developing a checklist for yourself as you're thinking of your own materials. I want you to think first about adaptation. Are you going to use something from a textbook or not? Are you going to think about directionality? Is it just going to be unidirectional? Are you going to have planned conversations with 2 speakers for bi-directional? And are you going to think about this idea of multi-directionality and bringing in resources that would show panel discussions or group projects? And so as we think about our materials and how we reconceptualize the materials, I want to go back to what I observed these very experienced teachers to be doing. So how do instructors currently structure the listening experience? Thinking again about before, during, and after listening practices. So the kinds of listening experiences based on what I saw when they considered source, they were providing really 4 central listening experiences. Either the textbook audio, and both teachers used the exact same textbook, not because it was planned, but by coincidence. And the choice they both chose for 2 different levels was the Listening and Note-Taking Skills 3, 4th edition. They also chose NPR Like You. They also chose TED Talks Like You, and then they considered or what I call live performance. The students giving an oral presentation while others had to listen and take notes in order to pose a follow-up question. So for the directionality of the adapted sources in the textbook audio, the majority of textbook audio I found is unidirectional. It's almost always in the form of a mock lecture on a range of topics, from anthropology to culture and history. There are a few textbooks that have videos where we see some bi-directionality, such as in National Geographic when they interview the actor Andrew McCarthy, but I did not observe any multi-directional listening tasks within the textbook audio or video in the classes I observed in this one particular setting. In terms of directionality of unadapted sources for NPR, the one time I saw it used, there was a news clip that was used at the end of a course, and it was used as a summative assessment. So the NPR news clip itself had actual multi-directional listening, which was great. It had multiple participants. It was something that was, I think, in total 35 minutes long, but the instructor chose to showcase 9 minutes of it for a final listening task, final assessment at the end of a course. But there hadn't been any multi-directional practice before this, and there hadn't been any other NPR sources used before this. So I thought that was interesting, because I would think that would be the most difficult for me as a listener when I'm using Spanish at work. It's much easier for me to listen to one person and track what they're saying than a whole room full of people, or listening to a Spanish newscast and then being asked questions about it. So I thought that was interesting. The TED Talks I observed in class were usually unidirectional and similar to a lecture style format. And then for live performances, which is what I meant when the students were giving a presentation, those provided a range of different types of directionality. The before listening practices that I observed most teachers to dedicate a significant amount of time to was preparing students for a future task, providing procedural direction, and activating background knowledge with that pre-vocabulary. And discussion tasks, the ELDs directed students to work in small groups on the pre-listening to explore what they already knew about a topic. So that was a very heavily saturated practice. But during listening practices were a bit more elusive. In fact, I use a question mark here. I'm not really sure that I ever saw anything that I would consider a during listening practice, as I try to define it within this listening experience descriptive framework. I took a stab at it, and for me, it meant when there was some kind of explicit instruction going on where the instructor was maybe pausing the audio and saying, was that the part you didn't understand? That was a confusing part. Let's unpack that. That's connected speech. Or let's look at this. That's a content word and a function word. You're probably hearing the stress and intonation of the content word and less so of the function word. So let's do some tasks here related to grammar. Let's revisit articles and prepositions and how they co-occur with certain content words. So when we think of these things, I was looking for that, where they had to listen to something specific, even if the teachers were asking the students to listen for a specific number or a date. So I found that if they provided listening experience using audio and visual, that was something that was considered a during. And if they considered something where they then also asked them to focus on a particular linguistic feature or aspect of the listening, that was another thing. Of the two instructors, both did one and only one did two. So it's interesting for me to think about what more can we do in terms of just providing an experience, just pressing play on the audio and saying, here you go. Okay, now let's assess how you got what you got out of that. What can we do during? How can we scaffold that more? So for after listening practices, the ELDs made a lot of use of the post-listening experiences. These were in the form of a fill in the gap for understanding or encouraging students to make personal connections to the listening, which again are great practices. But I still think we need to consider new materials. So the takeaway from this webinar, the first takeaway that I want you to have is that a descriptive framework for a listening experience might support what it is as researchers in particular we're looking for when we're going into a classroom and trying to qualify what exactly is the listening component of a classroom. So these listening related practices always involve some kind of fluid interactive processing. So what can we do to try to pin that down when it's such a covert operation? So a listening experience entails attention to adaptation, directionality, and source, in addition to scaffolding and during listening supports when designing lesson plans. The second takeaway I'd like you to have is that language instructors tend to favor unidirectional modes when designing listening experiences. These findings support what Graham, Santos, and Brophy 2014 have also found. And so I'm calling for more work involved with bi-directional and, most importantly, I feel, multi-directional to really prepare students, especially shy international students, how to engage in critical discussion so that their voices are heard. If we're not hearing from them, we're not going to know what they're thinking. We're not going to know what their view is. Maybe there's a solution to a great world problem that we're just not hearing about in the thick of that discussion. In total, I actually observed more unadapted than adapted listening sources in the studies and the observations I did, and more unidirectional than bi-directional. I think I observed more unadapted because I saw mostly in listening classes that meant student presentations. So again, the focus is on speaking more than listening. And the final takeaway that I'd like you to have is that although learners have been engaged in listening as a process, ELDs are not teaching explicitly about the listening process. What are needed are more focused aspects for intonation or prefixes, any other linguistic feature related to pragmatics, semantics, morphological features, anything to kind of raise attention for that during piece. And this finding is consistent with Siegel and Siegel 2015, calling for a more bottom-up approach to listening pedagogy in order to contribute to this process continuum. So in conclusion, it's been claimed that over 50% of the time is spent listening, and yet it's absolutely and arguably the least understood of what we do. Still, the research shows that it's a complex skill. It's hard to observe listening because it's invisible, it's covert, and it's hard to really define what listening looks like. In other ways that we'd like to assess is through the output, right? We'd like to value the oral presentation. I have a rubric. I can listen to the speaker and I can give them a grade. I want to see the essay. I can read the essay and mark it up again with a rubric and give a grade. But how do I grade how you're listening, other than to give you a comprehension test at the end of something? So my goal today was to, and in this study, was to study the kinds of pedagogical attention that listening is already receiving, and as it's still claimed by researchers as the least understood and the least practiced skill of all four skills. And now I want to turn it over to you for your questions and comments. And I just want to say thanks for being here today on a Friday. Some of you are signing in from places where I know it's 5 or 6 hours ahead, or hopefully not 12. Hopefully it's not 2 in the morning, but it's possible. But I want to hear your questions and comments, and thank you to SPLIS for having me here today.
So it looks like we have a few questions in the chat. I'm happy to forward those along here. So about during listening tasks, Joy asked whether you would consider guided questions as during listening practice.
Yeah, I think guided questions can help, Joy. I think any attention we give to that during. I didn't show it here, but I also did observe at least one of the instructors would play the audio and pause it and stop it, and then allow people time to answer a question, and then would play it again and stop, play, stop. So there was one day in particular, it was a lot of play, stop, but again, there wasn't any kind of systematic approach to that. So again, my argument is that listening is extremely complex, but it doesn't have to be chaotic, right? We have to think about our systematic approach. So if you're going to pause and have guided questions, think about how many times are you going to pause, or where are you going to pause? And are you going to ask your learners to write down content words and focus on those keywords? Well, those keywords are more likely easier to extract from the flow of communication. Just today, when I was observing students who are mostly first language Spanish speakers and a second language English environment, and I was observing an environmental studies class today, as I was observing, like, what part can you tell me can you understand without using Google Translate? Can you point to something in this environmental studies transcript of the class that you do understand? And one of the students could only point to content words that were more or less similar to English words, which makes sense, but the words she was putting into Google Translate were all the smaller function words. So it's something to consider when we think about guided questions, is like, still, what are the linguistic aspects of the actual language that you can untangle for your students, still within the guided questions, sure, but something even more focused than that. Does that help, Joy? Have I answered your question, or do you want to say more about your question if you feel comfortable unmuting yourself? Okay, we can go on to the next one, Kate.
Sure. Angela asked, would you pause the recording to discuss a particular issue during listening? And how would the students let you know that they are having trouble understanding the recording?
Thank you. That's a good question too, Egla. Thank you. Certainly during any kind of teaching, you can pause it any number of times that you feel comfortable with, as long as, again, you have a systematic approach to that and think about where in the listening you want to pause and why. If you're doing it in response to a student where you've observed this is where the student got stuck, this part right here, then that's where you pause, and maybe you want to amplify that part. Maybe you take a transcript, maybe you do some closed tasks for practice where you're omitting the function words and leaving the content words, and you're thinking very pragmatically, what are the sounds that co-occur? Which sounds are maybe, so again, this would be more the bottom-up practice, but which of the sounds are co-occurring with those, the words that are easier to identify? And what can you do in terms of teaching the grammar or revisiting prepositions of place or revisiting articles in terms of which words go together? So maybe that would help. Or you could also reconsider how you go about teaching vocabulary. When you are doing the vocabulary, are you teaching words in isolation in their lexical format, or are you teaching them as collocations? How much phrase level stress and intonation patterns are you teaching? And are you teaching the sounds of language? So do they have some kind of systematic approach to their vocabulary where it's not just orthographic, here's the word, here's the definition, here's the word form, here's how to use it in a sentence, but are you giving something like a sound system, a way to count how many syllables, which syllable receives primary stress, right? So they can start to make sense of these sounds. So Egla, to respond to your question, go ahead and pause during, right? Go ahead and give them something to help untangle it, and then collect data for yourself, and then play it again the next class, or play it again 2 weeks later and see if anything's changed. Keep at it, like keep systematically approaching this. Don't let them kind of slip away from you. Egla, have I answered your question, or do you want to say more?
Yes. No, yes, that's great, because I wasn't sure, if I'm focusing on one particular issue of the language. So how often do I need to, but you actually, explained very well, you have to have a system. You don't want to overdo it. But at the same time, you have to kind of like narrow it down and don't focus too much. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, you could even consider, like, I've been just keeping a little clipboard and I'm walking around
Right
with the students, writing down notes, identifying the learning gap. And then I think, oh, is this something that's coming out in their output, right? That maybe they're not getting it in the input. And so as I'm making those notes about output in their writing or their speaking, I'm thinking more about how does this error or this flip occur? And so can I do something more with input to address that and highlight that and make it a little more like meta focused than I have been, instead of being implicit about it or passive about it?
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Kate, do we have another one?
I'm going to send it over to William. He's got his hand raised. So go ahead,
okay.
William.
I will.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine. Thanks for being here. It's great to hear your voice.
Sure thing. I guess on the question of multi-directionality, the way I thought I heard you described it, it sounds like it was recordings of panel discussions. And to me, I feel like, wouldn't that really end up being unidirectionality as opposed to, say, like a live discussion? In my classes, I end up using and grading live discussions. And so students are kind of needing to engage with one another and respond to one another. So would that count as multi-directionality?
It would, because we're tracking multiple utterances by multiple speakers. So the distinction I think I'm hearing you drawing is between adapted and unadapted sources. So the saturated practice is to actually use more unadapted listening opportunities. So the student discussion is a really great practice. I encourage you to keep up with that practice. I've observed your classes before, and I know that you do a lot with fishbowls. I know you have students listen to TED Talks ahead of time and then come into their fishbowl ready to discuss and use their notes for that critical discussion. I think that's a really great practice that you can continue. But I think what I'm also trying to say is that you can enhance that with more scaffolding using an adapted form of that multi-directionality, or do something more during. So instead of just, it's game day, time to perform in Will's class, can I participate in today's critical discussion, or can I not participate because I don't feel comfortable? I can't track the people. So I'm saying maybe there's a safer, like a buffer space for us to scaffold and provide more explicit direction during instruction or during the process of development, rather than waiting for the game day performance, so to speak. Does that make sense? Do you want to say more about anything, or?
No, I mean, I think that's good. I mean, that's helpful feedback. I think over time, my own practice has evolved, and so I mean, one, I've gone to a more flipped approach, and so there's more discussion within each class period before we have the game day discussions, as you call it. So, but then I've also structured it so that the first half of the semester we have basically mock discussions where we debrief them together, and then for the second half they're graded, and so students are getting private feedback about their private detailed feedback, but there's no debrief kind of on the spot. So anyway, so this is helpful.
Yeah, and so the thing I would add is that we're still overvaluing speaking and undervaluing the act of listening. Still in that discussion, there's more of a focus on the speaking and the output. And I'm asking us to reconsider that. I want to do more with the input, because listening is the foundational skill for second language development. It's the number one. It comes before everything else. We learn it in utero, right? It's really the first thing we're learning is the sound system. So I'm asking for more explicit hyper attention to just the listening part, and not just focusing on that, what I called the live experience, the student discussion, the student presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. So
thanks. Next question, Kate.
Yeah. So Anna asks, would peer feedback offer an opportunity for both listening and speaking? I've used this in groups where speakers are part of a group and their group members discuss their presentation.
Yeah, Anna, I think that's a wonderful practice. And again, everything I'm hearing all of you mentioned are so far really great examples. I'm just asking us to build upon these. So absolutely, things in terms of peer-to-peer, even better. That taps into our socio-cultural approaches. It's getting us out of just these cognitive top-down and bottom-up processes. It's also very interactive. But the socio-cultural part is also very important. How I react to a peer is important. How I speak to my friend is very different from the way I maybe speak to a professor or, my boss or supervisor, so we change. So I think getting that feedback, and if you're your peers are able to detect places even in your output where maybe you're making spoken errors and are signaling to you, hey, didn't catch that part. It wasn't intelligible for me or comprehensible. You know, maybe there's some kind of system they're developing where they stop, they repeat themselves. You can teach, excuse me, could you repeat that? I didn't catch that. But that's again kind of also, is it the speaker or was it the listener? We don't know. So it's providing a safe space to practice that exchange. Language is social, right? Language cannot be done in isolation. So everyone will be different. Every student, every learner is different. And so again, it's tapping into this idea of the complexity of the learner. But anytime we can empower our students, we want to do that. Anytime they can bring the materials they want to listen to, or they choose the topic, they can give each other feedback rather than it coming from the teacher. I feel like that's a move I would support. That from the research I've read, that's a move in the right direction. So Anna, I would keep going with that practice. But then think about, again, raising awareness, helping the students raise awareness for each other about those linguistic aspects that are really tricky. The connected speech in particular is very tricky. So help each other more. Great question. Thank you, Anna. I hope I've answered that clearly for you.
Okay, maybe time for one more. This will probably need to be our last question. But Jennifer asked, how do you feel about transcription activities for bottom-up skills practice?
Great. I'm a huge fan of bottom-up transcripts. But I think we don't have enough research on that area to determine how much. So what I mean by that is if it's a 35-minute NPR, you can't give the entire transcript for a 35-minute NPR segment. So how do you select which segment of the transcript to focus on? How many words are you omitting for your bottom-up approach? Which words are you omitting for your bottom-up approach? And has it already been taught in the classroom? Is it something that you've already created awareness around? Or is this something you're just kind of pulling out of the dark? So when I first started using closed tasks and transcripts, I did it with music early on in my career. And I'm thinking about returning to this. You know, it's funny how we go in cycles, but I would always just take a song I liked that I thought the students would like, kind of randomly go through and omit a few of the words, give them the transcript with words omitted, listen to the song. They had to write in the words that were missing, play it again, and then everyone sang the song at the end of class. But I didn't have a systematic approach. I wasn't really trained. I didn't even know like which words should I omit and why. I didn't have any rationale for my selection. So I think transcripts are wonderful. I think bottom-up transcripts are great, just as long as, again, you're using a systematic approach, there's a rationale to it. So I would start by omitting the function words. Everyday prepositions, maybe like at, on, in, are a good place to start, or just articles, and the, and omitting just those for a little while. Train them until they get better, then try omitting something else. Train them until they get better, then give them more complicated aspects, get into the pragmatics, and then eventually you can get into the super segmental level of stress, which is really hard. But then you're starting to go into pragmatics and you can really start to get into, it's not what we say, but how we say it that conveys the real meaning, you know, behind our speech. And that's a harder thing to raise awareness around, but that could be the ultimate goal with your bottom-up task, is to go beyond the bottom-up.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay.
Wonderful. I know there were a few additional questions, and I'm sorry that we don't have time to get to all those, but I do want to respect everybody's time and schedule. So thank you all for this discussion and your additional questions that you had. With that, we will conclude today's webinar. Just as a reminder, today's presentation was titled Re-Conceptualizing the Materials English Language Development Teachers Use to Design Listening Experiences for University-Bound Multilingual Scholars. I want to send a special thank you to our presenter, Dr. LaCroix, so thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, thank you all for attending, and you may now disconnect.